Our guest is Robert Madison, Bob Madison, he prefers, I'm told. He's a historian, lecturer, and author. He's here specifically to talk about his latest work, New Haven and Northampton Canal Greenway. Mr. Madison, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Glad to have you. The book is, strictly speaking, a guide to recreational areas, bike and rail trails along the old New Haven and Northampton Canal Greenway. But I don't know that many of us who've lived in Western Mass for a long time, or maybe grew up here, know that much about, or even know there was a very important waterway linking Northampton down through Connecticut, all the way to Long Island Sound.
New Haven, yes. In fact, I didn't learn about the canal until maybe 10 years ago. Back when I was in high school, in Westfield High School, I would walk across the canal to catch a bus every day, not realizing that the canal went right by my parents' house. And right now on Shaker Road in Westfield, a lot of homes are actually built on the canal, and people don't even realize that there was a canal there.
I had no idea. I had no idea myself. It really is a little known part, but a very important part of the development of Western Massachusetts and this corridor, Northampton, leading down south, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, when they finished the Erie Canal in 1825, they came over to Massachusetts and Connecticut, and they started at Congamon Lake.
In Southwick?
In Southwick.
Okay.
1825, they started building the canal and working their way south through 28 locks to get down to New Haven, Connecticut. And then when they finished that, they started again in Congamon Lake in Southwick. They worked their way north to Northampton. Now, the Southwick Historical Society has picked up on this, and they are actually sponsoring me in the book. All the funds for the book, my lectures and donations, go to the Southwick Historical Society for the main purpose of buying these historic roadside plaques. And it could simply say, canal crossing. Now, there are plenty of signs on a trail, because every town has a group of people that sponsors a trail, made it happen. Again, I say plenty of signs, but I just want a canal crossing sign to show people that something historic happened here 2 centuries ago, and a lot of people don't know about it.
And it meant a lot to our area. I want to go back in and kind of draw out your answer there. Contains about $1 million worth of information I want to try and draw out. You mentioned summer of 1825, July, folks who were involved in development of the Erie Canal in upstate New York, not far from here. I grew up along the old Erie Canal, so I know what you're saying. Came and they started working south. An amazing engineering feat when you think you don't have any of the automatic drilling or digging stuff you have today.
All by hand, yes, sir.
And they had to go all the way to New Haven, Long Island Sound, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, but you mentioned 28 locks. Yes. That's basically lowering the level of the water so that boats can travel down as the landscape lowers heading toward the ocean. That's an enormous feat.
And now Congamon Lake is some 220 feet above sea level. So you had to work your way down these 28 locks to get to New Haven. Pretty amazing, if you think about it.
You know, think of the engineering challenge. Now, I know, again, from the history I learned in my hometown, the Erie Canal was a tremendous engineering problem and a health problem. Here they were digging in, often bad weather, mosquito infested. There were immigrant teams. What do we know about the efforts here and the folks? They started in July 1825. Here they are in the hottest of weather and in very hard work.
It was all done by hand. And some of it was nice and flat. Some of it was marshland. There's a certain section between Granby and Southington where it's 26 miles of flat, no locks at all. But in all cases, the canal kind of followed the contours of the mountains and the land. And then when the canal went bust because someone invented the steam engine and they put the railroad tracks on the towpath, that was pretty much of a straight line. At that point in time, you can go in a straight line, in which we see today in terms of they pulled up the tracks, paved it, now it's our greenway, a rail trail.
So that was phase one, 1825, Southwick to New Haven and Long Island Sound, but they wanted to unite that canal to the north of us and everything going on. So up to Northampton now, and there's another 105-foot gradient difference, as I understand it from your writing. 32 locks are needed.
Yes.
And they started doing this in the winter, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So even more hardships.
But it took them a lot longer to do the Northampton section than in New Haven, a few more years longer, just because once you got into the interior of western New England, commerce was less and less, fewer buildings and whatnot, and quite frankly, not quite as much interest. More interest in the canal in Connecticut than in Massachusetts. Now, when they got to Northampton, the ultimate plan was to get to Northampton, and if someone didn't invent the steam engine, they would have gone all the way to Vermont and ultimately to the St. Lawrence River. That was the plan. Erie Canal went to the Great Lakes. They wanted this canal to go to the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Now, the Erie Canal, of course, linked up with the Hudson River to New York City, and really was instrumental to some extent in making New York the world center it became today, outstripping Boston, which was really then the leading port closest to Europe by a day or two sailing time. Was the hope of this canal to try and maybe retrieve some of that, to fight the Erie Canal? Was it a competition at all, do we know?
Well, the real competition was between New Haven and Hartford, because back then, every 2 years, they switched the capital back and forth. 2 years it was New Haven, 2 years it was in Hartford. Now, Hartford had the Connecticut River. They kind of controlled the whole thing up to Northampton, up north at the Vermont and New Hampshire. So New Haven wanted to do something about this. They wanted their own route into the interior of western New England. Therefore, this is how they created the canal, the prospect of it, and developed it that way.
Do we know much about, well, let me ask you, one of the things that fascinates me is, where did you go to get your research? I mean, it's fascinating. Did you have to go to each town's library or historic society, or how did you get the material?
There are a few people, like Dr. Carl Walter, a retired physician from Westfield, Nova Hospital. He spent, since 1992, walking the canal. There were no maps of it. The maps of the canal itself were lost. So he researched this himself, and he has some spectacular maps, town by town by town, showing where the canal is, various features, where the locks are, things of that nature. Now, he's created maps of both Connecticut and Massachusetts. And in back of his maps, he gets into great detail as to how they created the canals and who did what. Then there's Ruth Hummel, who passed away a couple of years ago in Plainville, Connecticut. She wrote a book about the canal in Plainville. Just really basically Plainville, but she talks about the locks, the boats, sizes, and different people who were involved in creating the canal. Then there are other books that would not throughout. A lot of magazine articles, newspaper articles, and various people published bits and pieces of it. So I spent my time researching this information and pulling it together to create the book. But my real interest was the canal itself. Now, when I first started the project, I was thinking about writing a book about the canal. But it could be boring. All right, it's 34 feet wide, 20 feet at the bottom, you know. This is how they built the canal. This is how they built the lock. But very quickly, I bore people. And then I decided that, wait a minute, what we have now is a rail trail. The rail trail is some 86, 87 miles long between, in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And they're developing the rail trail. The towpath, they paved it, they took the tracks out, and now people can walk it, hike it, ride their bicycles on it.
And we thank you for coming in and sharing with us. Bob Madison, author of New Haven and Northampton Canal Greenway. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.